Story 1. The Hidden Cabin. I was in my mid-20s when my father died and left behind more questions than memories. He'd split from my mom years earlier, disappearing into a quiet life up the coast. He never fought for custody, rarely called, and seemed to fade into a kind of rumor. So when the lawyer read his will and mentioned a log cabin he'd built on a scrap of land near Black Marble Mountain, it hit me like a punch. Mom swore she'd never heard of it. My brother shrugged. But I couldn't let it go. Why would my father build a secret cabin deep in the woods and never tell anyone? I drove up in November, when the sky was a dull steel and the forest felt already half asleep. The town nearest the land, Happy Camp, looked like something from a forgotten postcard. Gas station, rafting company, a diner with one neon light still flickering. From there, it was a hike of nearly 5 miles through dense forest. The air got colder and damper with each step. My boots crunched over layers of pine needles, and every now and then a crow would break the silence with a harsh caw. It took hours to reach the GPS point the lawyer had given me. When I first saw the cabin through the trees, I thought I'd gotten it wrong. It was small, sagging, and almost hidden beneath moss and dead branches. The roof slumped like a broken spine. The only window was missing glass, but the door was reinforced with metal plates, shiny in contrast to the rot around it. I hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting it to fall apart in my hands. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something metallic. Every wall was covered in maps, dozens of them, each covered with circles, grid marks, scribbled notes and dates. On the table lay a revolver and a box of ammunition beside empty water bottles and camping stoves. And scattered among the maps were photographs. At first they seemed normal, family shots, fishing trips. But as I looked closer, I realized almost all were of the same man. Wild red hair, pale eyes, and a slow transformation from clean-cut to feral. Some were clearly taken from a distance, as if my father had been tracking him. One note pinned to a map read, "He's still here." Another written in thick block letters, "Too close." The sun dipped quickly, and by the time I finished looking around, it was dark enough that my lantern cast long shadows against the maps. The cabin felt like a watchtower, like whoever built it knew something was out there. I bolted the door, closed the makeshift shutter over the window, and tried to steady myself on the narrow cot. Around 2:30 a.m., footsteps woke me. Not animal scurrying, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed the revolver, heart hammering. Through a gap in the shutter, I saw a shape moving between trees, tall, pale, and completely naked except for streaks of dirt and leaves stuck to its skin. Long, knotted red hair swung as it moved. It didn't look up at me, didn't speak, just circled like a predator testing a cage. Then it stopped. The forest went silent. My breath sounded like thunder in the tiny room. I yelled that I had a gun, that I'd shoot if it came closer. Nothing. Then, without warning, it bolted straight at the door, full sprint. The sound of its feet pounding on the soil and then slamming into the reinforced door made the whole cabin shake. I stumbled back, gripping the revolver, praying the plates would hold. Instead of breaking through, the thing began softly knocking. Tap, tap, tap. Then harder and harder until the wood creaked. That's when I realized it wasn't knocking with its hand. Each thud came from something heavier, the rhythm exactly at head height. It was slamming its forehead into the door, over and over, each impact a dull crack. I screamed that my father was dead, that I wasn't him, that I didn't know what it wanted. The banging stopped. For a moment there was only my own ragged breathing. Then, from the other side of the door, a hoarse voice croaked my father's name, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. I froze, gun trembling. It said the name again, louder. I told it again that my father had passed, that I'd leave at first light, that I wanted no trouble. Silence stretched. Then the footsteps began again, moving away into the trees, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky began to pale, I grabbed my bag and left. The door was wet with something, maybe saliva, maybe blood. Every rustle in the trees sent me spinning with the revolver raised. I hiked until I saw the road, until I reached my car, until civilization's noise drowned out the forest. Back home, I called the ranger station, trying to report a wild man near Black Marble Mountain without sounding insane. The ranger on duty only sighed and said I wasn't the first to call about a naked red-haired hermit in the woods, and probably wouldn't be the last. Apparently he'd been seen for over a decade, scaring hikers but never attacking anyone. I hung up, feeling no relief. My father had built that cabin like a fortress, and whatever haunted those woods, whatever whispered his name in the dark, was still out there. Story 2. The Journal in the Woods. It was early September of '93, the last stretch of summer before classes started again. My friends and I, 4 college juniors from Seattle, had been talking for months about doing a real backcountry camping trip. No more car camping with beer coolers and picnic tables. We wanted rugged, remote, and silent. Olympic National Park seemed perfect. Rugged mountains, moss-draped rainforests, and enough trails to lose ourselves on. We loaded up on a Thursday, buzzing with road trip energy, stereo blasting, all of us joking about how this'll be our survival story. Our plan was simple: park near Fairholme, hike to a lookout point, spend 3 nights under the stars, then amble back to the car. We weren't experts, but we weren't complete newbies either, confident enough to believe we couldn't possibly get lost. That confidence lasted about a day. By late Friday, we'd been walking for hours through forests so thick it swallowed daylight. Trees leaned in from every direction, moss and ferns blurred one trail into another. We still knew our compass bearings, but had no clue which path was which anymore. Just when our patience began to fray, we saw something through the trees. A roof, low and sagging, camouflaged under dead leaves. At first it looked abandoned, a small, leaning cabin, windows fogged with grime, vines creeping up the walls. The door was cracked open. Inside was the kind of mess you'd expect in an old hiker's stopover. Rusted cooking pots, dented cans, a stained sleeping bag slumped against a wall. The fireplace was cold, the air stale. On the table sat a crumpled deck of playing cards, scattered like a game abandoned mid-hand. We were tired. It felt like a stroke of luck. We swept some trash aside, unpacked our camp stove on the porch, and ate lunch under the sagging roof. As we did, I noticed an old nightstand in the back room, its drawers cobwebbed shut. Curiosity won. I pushed through the webs, yanked open the first drawer, just random junk. Second drawer, empty pill bottles. Third drawer, something heavy and leather-bound. It was a journal. The first entries were from 1978, the handwriting neat, almost cheerful. The author described moving off-grid to escape modern life, detailed plans of hunting, foraging, making a new life among the trees. It was idealistic, even inspiring. I read it aloud to my friend Steve, joking that it could be a bestseller. But as we flipped forward, the tone shifted. By the early 1980s, the entries turned darker, paranoid, rambling, complaints about voices in the trees and the sky singing. Notes about killing rabbits to cleanse my own soul. The elegant handwriting collapsed into jagged scratches. By 1989, whole pages were nothing but symbols, spirals, and words like blood god and finish the game. And then came the part that made my stomach drop. An entry dated only weeks earlier, September 1993, the very month we were there. It wasn't an abandoned cabin. It was his cabin. I flipped to the last page. They're coming closer. I must finish. The ink looked fresh, not faded. My skin crawled. I turned to Steve and hissed, "We need to leave, now." But the others were still busy trying to light a fire in the stone fireplace, half listening to my panic. It wasn't until I showed them the fresh pages filled with symbols that they believed me. We packed our gear in a flurry, hearts thudding. As we hurried away from the cabin, the forest felt different, watching, listening. Every snapped twig sounded like a footstep behind us. By dusk, we'd put a good mile between us and that place, but the sense of being followed wouldn't shake off. We camped in a small clearing by the river, deciding to climb to the lookout at first light. No one laughed anymore. Even our whispered jokes died off. When the fire burned low, we huddled closer, eyes darting at every sound. Around 11 p.m., a scream split the night. It started as a howl, then rose into something human and ragged, echoing across the valley. It wasn't a cougar's screech or a bear's roar. It carried pain and fury in it, like a person who'd been alone too long. The scream faded into silence. Steve whispered, "That's him."
None of us argued. We knew it was the man from the journal. In seconds, we stomped out our fire, jammed our half-packed gear into bags, and started moving. We didn't speak except for the occasional whispered direction. Every shadow felt like a figure held. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. We walked all night, our eyes straining at the dark, until finally, just as dawn turned the sky gray, we saw the roof of the general store where our car was parked. We threw our gear into the trunk and peeled out, hands shaking on the wheel, silence heavy in the car. One of my friends muttered that we should have taken the journal as proof. Another hissed that stealing from someone that unhinged was the dumbest idea imaginable. Nobody spoke after that. Even now, decades later, I wonder who wrote those last pages. Whether he watched us from the trees that night, whether the scream was a warning or a promise.
Story 3. Cabin number 9. Back when I was 19, I had what seemed like the easiest night job in the world. I worked as a night porter at a mountain cabin resort in Montana. Half security guard, half front desk clerk. My duties were simple: keep the keys organized, handle late check-ins, and patrol the grounds now and then. The owners had even set up a VHS player in the office to help pass the time, so most nights were just me, the hum of the soda machine, and whatever horror tape I'd rented that week. This particular night was cold enough to sting your lungs when you breathed in. Around 1 in the morning, I was halfway through Hellraiser, feet up on the desk, when I heard something outside the office. Not a branch snapping, not the wind, movement. Heavy enough to make the porch boards creak. We had big glass windows on the front and side walls of the office, plus a glass panel in the door, so I could see shapes moving in the dark. Sometimes guests went stargazing or took late walks, so at first I didn't think much of it. But then the sound came again. Slower, heavier. Not footsteps exactly. More like something crawling, dragging itself across the ground. That was enough to make me mute the TV. I slipped my hand under the counter where we kept a revolver locked in the safe. Officially, it was for bears or mountain lions. Unofficially, it was for anything else that wandered too close. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as I walked to the window, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the gravel driveway. Nothing. Just night fog and tree shadows. Then, from directly beneath the window, a man rose up. I jumped back so hard I hit the chair. He was pale, filthy, his shirt soaked with a reddish-brown smear that dripped down to his jeans. His mouth and chin looked stained, but not for food. It was darker, more viscous. He pressed a trembling hand to the glass for balance, smearing it, then collapsed back down out of sight. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Then, training kicked in. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher asked me what was wrong. I stammered about a man outside, bleeding, maybe drunk or injured. She asked me to go back and get details for the paramedics. I crept outside, keeping my distance. He was on his knees, swaying. I asked what happened, what he'd taken, anything. All he could do was groan, words muffled and wet. Then, I caught 2 clear words. Number 9. It took me a second to connect the dots. He wasn't asking for a drink. He was trying to tell me where. Cabin number 9. I ran back inside, confirmed with dispatch that an ambulance was on the way, then grabbed a flashlight and bolted down the gravel path toward cabin 9. Even before I reached it, I could smell something sour and metallic on the breeze. The door stood open, a trail of the same reddish-brown liquid staining the steps. Inside was chaos. 2 people were collapsed, one on the couch, one on the floor, while a third clung to the sink, retching something dark and viscous into the basin. Empty wine bottles and liquor littered the counter. Plates with scraps of food sat abandoned. The air smelled like rot and chemicals. I kept my distance, covering my sleeve with my sleeve, shouting over the gagging. "What did you eat? What did you drink?" The standing man turned, eyes bloodshot and glassy, and rasped, "Help, please," before sinking to the ground. His trembling hand pointed toward the kitchen table where half a dozen bottles stood, wine, whiskey, cheap vodka, and plates of food half-eaten. Everything in me screamed to run, but instead I backed out carefully, keeping my flashlight trained on them, and sprinted back to the office phone to relay what I'd seen. Within 20 minutes, the resort's entrance was a parade of flashing lights. Not 1 ambulance, 4. Paramedics swarmed the cabin, suiting up with gloves and masks, hauling the victims onto stretchers. My boss arrived in his truck, hair sticking up from bed, eyes wide when I told him what had happened.
Later that morning, after hours of chaos, my boss shared what he'd learned from the deputies. The group in Cabin 9 had been old friends meeting for a weekend reunion. One of them, a woman from Washington, had planned the trip. She'd arrived smiling, laden with food and wine, then slipped out hours later after cutting the phone line and quietly poisoning the meal with weed killer and rat poison. By the time I saw them, the poison was doing its work. If the first victim hadn't dragged himself to the office, if I hadn't called 911 when I did, they might have all died out there. Cleanup crews later went into Cabin 9 wearing masks and gloves. Even after the victims were removed, the smell lingered for days, a chemical tang mixed with bile and something like iron. To this day, the image of that man rising under my office window, eyes pleading through the glass, still flashes into my dreams. At 19, I thought the night shift was an easy way to earn money and watch free movies. That night changed everything. Now, when someone says Cabin 9, I don't picture a cozy retreat in the woods. I picture a place where a cheerful weekend turned into a nightmare, and where a stranger's groaned warning, just 2 words, might have been the only thing standing between life and death.
Story 4. Grandfather's Secret Past. When I was growing up, my grandfather was a paradox. At Christmas, he'd give me envelopes of cash big enough to cover a semester of textbooks, yet when I ran to hug him, he'd stiffen like I was a stranger. He was generous but distant, friendly but cold-eyed. My parents always chalked it up to the way he was raised, the Great Depression, a hard childhood, a lifetime of work. But they never told me the whole story, not until after he died. At his funeral, people shared the usual warm anecdotes. His construction business, his generosity, his no-nonsense attitude. I stood there wondering why the man who loved me enough to spoil me at every birthday also kept me at arm's length my entire life. The day after the funeral, my father called me into the living room, shut the door, and said, "It's time you knew the truth." He told me that when my grandfather was a boy, in the early 1930s, his family fled Denver for the foothills of the Rockies, carving out a life in a handmade log cabin. It was survival, not adventure. A stove, a chimney, 2 shared beds, and little else. My great-grandfather hunted and trapped. My great-grandmother kept a vegetable patch. They bartered meat and hides in town when they could, but mostly they survived off the land. My grandfather, then just a child, grew up without school, birthdays, or neighbors, just endless days of chores and cold nights under thin blankets. And then came the night that changed everything. They were eating supper when a knock came at the door. Not a neighborly knock, but hard, commanding fists. My great-grandfather whispered for the children to climb out the back window and run for the tree line. As my grandfather and his little sister scrambled out, he heard raised voices, then screaming, then a crash of splintering wood. My great-grandfather shouted for them to keep running. Then came sounds a child couldn't mistake. Blows, choking, a final strangled cry. For days, my grandfather, his mother, and his sister wandered the foothills, hiding under brush, surviving on handfuls of berries and melted snow. When they finally crept back, the cabin was ransacked, the door hanging open. Their mother sent them to wait in the trees while she buried their father and scrubbed the blood from the floors. In one night, at 9 years old, my grandfather became the man of the house. He never went back to school. Instead, he trapped small animals, hauled firewood, and patched the leaking roof while his mother cooked and his sister cleaned. By 13, he'd saved enough to buy a mule named Chip, which he rode into Evergreen to do odd jobs for a construction company. Those wages kept his family alive. He learned carpentry, masonry, and grit the hard way. Yet one thing about the cabin nagged at him: the chimney. Every autumn he'd clean it, scraping out soot and loose bricks. Birds nested there in summer, smoke leaked in winter, and each year it seemed weaker, as if something inside pushed outward. On his 18th birthday, as summer slid into fall, he jammed his brush up into the chimney and a brick came loose, tumbling down in a puff of soot. Reaching up to reset it, his fingers brushed cloth, not bird bones. He pulled out 3 small burlap sacks and opened one. Inside were gold coins, dozens of them, heavy as stones and gleaming even in the dim firelight. Suddenly, all the pieces fit. The strangers, the murder, the secrecy. His father hadn't been killed at random. He'd been hiding a fortune in the chimney. No one knows where the coins came from. Maybe his father had stolen them. Maybe someone else stashed them there thinking the cabin was forgotten. My great-grandmother had no idea. But the gold changed everything. Within 2 years, they were back in Denver, living in a modest but sturdy house.
My grandfather poured himself into construction work, starting his own company before he was 25, driven to escape poverty forever. Yet the trauma of that cabin clung to him. Every time he looked at me, blonde-haired, small, always curious, he saw his little sister huddled in the woods, waiting for her mother to bury their father. It explained the coldness behind his gifts, the distance behind his generosity. Hearing all of this rewrote my childhood memories. The gruff man I thought was simply hard-edged was in fact carrying a wound that had never healed. Those gold coins had built a business, bought comfort, and funded the gifts he gave me, but they were also stained with a night of terror and loss. Now when I think of my grandfather, I don't picture the businessman at his desk. I picture a barefoot boy in the Rockies, holding his sister's hand as strangers destroy the only home he's ever known. And I imagine the same boy, years later, pulling a brick from a chimney and realizing that the fortune hidden there was both salvation and curse. Knowing the truth didn't make his death easier, but it made sense of everything. The distance, the generosity, the unspoken shadows in our family. I like to think that if he could hear me now, he'd know I finally understand him, and that the little girl he saw in me has grown up enough to forgive the boy he once was.